Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Valley Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes. And today we're going to be discussing Ur-Markus and the formation of the Gospel of Mark. So, Frank, thank you very much for joining me today. And can you tell us exactly what is Ur-Markus for those that are not familiar with that hypothetical text?
Well, Marcus is in German. Marcus is the Gospel of Mark. They would call it Das Evangelium nach Marcus or Das Marcus Evangelium. And so the theory um, that was put together in the 1830s or so was called a book called Ur-Markus, and it means a primitive mark. In other words, a form of the Gospel of Mark that is earlier than the Gospel of Mark, whose Greek text we have. And so the Gospel of Mark is of great interest if you believe the usual um, understanding that Mark is a source for Matthew and Luke and therefore predates Matthew and Luke. And so, unless you date Q very, very early, um, then the earliest real narrative of the life of Jesus is Mark. And so, if you could find um, a more primitive form of Mark than the Mark that we have, then you're getting closer and closer historically to Jesus. I'm talking about the general assumptions that people have had when they were investigating the historical Jesus. And if you would throw that first slide on there, that's the usual picture of yeah. This is the four source theory. This is most of what you see in Streeter. I don't have Proto Luke or anything like that, but in other words, Mark and Q are the sources for Matthew and Luke. And of course, Streeter created this theoretical source called M for the stuff that's in Matthew that's not in Q, that's not in Mark. And he created this thing called L, which was the stuff in Luke that was not in Q nor in Mark. But those, that's very theoretical. The main thing is Mark and Q are the sources for Matthew and Luke. And so that's without M and L, you got the two source theory. And with M and L, the two source theory becomes the four source theory. And so every New Testament scholar on planet Earth has taught this or something very much like it to beginning students of the Gospels. I've taught it to lay people in Barbados. I mean, I've taught it everywhere. Um, and I've taught it to lay people in Shreveport and Monroe, as well as my own parishioners here in Ruston. And so this is the rather too neat diagram to account for the two sources of Mark and Q. And of course, where Matthew and Luke in a Markan passage, where Matthew and Luke where they disagree with Mark against Mark in a Markan passage, those have been referred to by Streeter as the minor agreements. And you have to try to explain the minor agreements and why, as you believe, they are minor. Um, if you went to the next slide, let me give, well, yes. The basic assumption of Life of Jesus research is that earlier is better. In other words, if Mark is first of the Synoptic Gospels, as far as there being a narrative, I'm not talking about Q with, a bunch of sayings strung together. But if Mark is first, where you have a narrative and you have not only the words of Jesus, you also have miracle stories. You also have the passion narrative, and 16:1 through 8, you have the empty tomb story. And so there's no source earlier than that if you believe Markan priority. And so if you can date Mark really early as the 60s, or as early as the 70s, then you are talking about something that was written and circulating in the early church at least no more than, well, 4 decades after Jesus' death. And by the standards of antiquity, that's really, really, really early. Um, and independently of each other, Christian Hermann Weisse and Christian Gottlob Wilke, uh, both in the same year, but independently, proposed that Mark was first. But before that, everyone believed Matthew was first. The reason they believed Matthew was first is because of the preface to Luke, Luke 1 1 through 4. Many, there are many that have put together narratives of the things that have happened. And so, given that the preface to Luke says that there are many narratives of the things that have happened among us, namely the life of Jesus, then few, if any, very few people propose Lucan priority because of what Luke says in Luke 1 1 through 4. Basically, the idea is earlier is better. Go on to the next slide if you would. Earlier is better. And of course, one of the major things that was very controversial in the 1880s and thereafter was the publication of Westcott and Hort's Greek New Testament in 1881, which they called the New Testament in the original Greek. And in the same year, the revised version of the Bible appeared. And there were these three manuscripts that Hort believed were from a text type called the neutral text, which we now call the Alexandrian text. And so Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus go to the fourth century, and Codex Alexandrinus goes to the fifth century. And so, even though there are hundreds, if not thousands, more manuscripts that are much later, um, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Sinaiticus are so much earlier, going back to the fourth and fifth century, then we have a text that is believed to be considerably more accurate than the text that was used by the King James Version translators and their predecessors. Most of their manuscripts probably, well, mostly they probably use Erasmus, the 16th century printed edition. And there would be few of their manuscripts that would go back before the 10th century. So, in other words, you got fewer manuscripts, but they were considerably earlier. And so Westcott and Hort at Cambridge believed, hey, we've got a much more accurate Greek text. It's 5 centuries earlier than we had before. And therefore, let's reconstruct the text based on the so called neutral text, which we now call the Alexandrian text. So that's the basic assumption. Earlier is closer to Jesus. And
And oh, go ahead.
well, you go ahead.
Well, okay, what I was going to ask, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was going to ask is, when I say earlier is better, did they mean that in the sense that, okay, the earlier the text, the more likely it's telling reliable, truthful things about the historical Jesus? And does that always necessarily mean that? Can later text have things that are early as well?
Well, yes, but the basic idea is, would you rather have a 10th or 12th century text of what Jesus said, or would you rather have a fourth century text of what Jesus said, given that
Right.
Jesus lived in the first century? In other words, a lot of what was going on during the life of Jesus research all through the 19th century was the idea that the early church, you know, Jesus didn't go around saying, "Well, I'm God." And the early church um, created, dogmatic theology. The early church created Christology. The early church created the doctrine of the Trinity and all of that. And so they were willing to say that all of that stuff that a great deal of what the early church taught about Jesus, namely Christology and the doctrine of the Trinity, etc., did not really go back to the historical Jesus. It went back to the controversies in the early church. And therefore, what you really need to do is instead of paying rather too much attention to what the early church said about itself or said about its Lord, pay more attention by using human reason and read the text for yourself. Read the Greek text for yourself. Read the most accurate Greek text for yourself. Don't read what a bunch of church fathers said in the fourth century or thereafter, or Middle Ages. So it was a very honorable attempt, I think, to go back to the earliest sources. And now you have a slide that I've never seen anybody else with a slide like this. But you can see that I would argue that this is how we get the Gospels. First of all, in the upper left-hand corner of there, you got the oral teaching of Jesus, and he taught the people in his mother tongue, Aramaic. He probably also knew biblical Hebrew, right? But his mother tongue was Aramaic, and his disciples' mother tongue was Aramaic. And of course, Aramaic is close to Hebrew. It's a Semitic language that both Aramaic and Hebrew are Northwest Semitic, and they both go back to Proto-Semitic, we believe. But anyway, the oral teaching of Jesus was in Aramaic, and the apostles, after Jesus' death, and I would argue after his resurrection, formed early Jesus believing communities. And in these early Jesus believing communities, they created narratives of the words and works of Jesus. Jesus said this. Jesus healed the man born blind. Jesus um, healed the leper. And so these stories of the deeds of Jesus, which are primarily miracle stories, of which there are, 24 or so in Mark, um, these were told in early churches for centuries. And when the Gospels appeared as written texts, the oral tradition of what Jesus said and what Jesus did, that oral tradition did not die. But then, as churches started being formed around the Mediterranean Sea by people like Barnabas and Paul, then these stories about Jesus made the jump into Hellenistic Greek. We don't really know how early that was. But by the time of Paul, Paul has not heard that the gospel is a book. Paul has not heard that there is some kind of written source with the words and works of Jesus. He thinks the gospel is the saving message about Jesus, and he understands himself to be preaching the gospel, not, the gospel of Mark or Luke or anybody. So anyway, these narratives are being circulated orally in Gentile churches, or at least, I mean, they might have been Jewish congregations, but they were Greek speaking. And then they become narratives of the words and works of Jesus, and they get edited a lot, a whole bunch. And then the editing goes on. And then you can see I have different colored and different shapes of arrows. And those arrows point you to the Gospels. And that would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, whatever Marcion had, what all of the other Gospels are in, by the very late first century or early second century, you're getting Gospels in written form, as far as we know for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then the other Gospels, such as the Gospel that Marcion quotes. Of course, Marcion is a bit later, But nonetheless, um, when you're trying to figure out what Jesus said and did, you're trying to go backwards on this diagram. See, you're trying to go backwards to the words and works of Jesus in their collections. And then you're trying to figure out what the words and works of Jesus were before the collections that we have. See? So you can read the Gospels that we have, and then you can also ask questions about the Gospels that we have by way of trying to reconstruct the steps between the oral teaching of Jesus in Aramaic and the Greek Gospels that we have. Now, what do we know? We know that Jesus spoke Aramaic, and we know that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and many of their sources, if not all of their sources, were in Greek. And so this is a theoretical reconstruction of the steps between the oral teaching of Jesus and the Gospels that we have. And so, given that we can't really know that much about the intervening steps, this is a reasonable reconstruction of what went on between the oral teaching of Jesus in Aramaic and the Gospels that we have in Hellenistic Greek. And of course, Mark preserves a few little bits and pieces. You know, be opened is ephata, and Abba is in the construct state or the of Av, father. So we have bits and pieces of Aramaic preserved in Mark. And therefore, given that editing that has gone on, we shouldn't think that we're talking about a word for word transcript in Greek of tape recordings of the teachings of Jesus. There's just no reason to believe that. And then let's go on to that next slide. What the Gospels are is they are, in fact, interpretation in in the late first century church or churches. They are interpretations of Jesus through the lenses of um, late first century church. And in the Gospel of John, I would argue the early second century. We are separated from Jesus by 20 centuries. But Mark is really important because I believe, as far as I know or believe, over 90% of all New Testament scholars around the world believe in Markan priority. Some people might dispute that number, but I think it's well over 90%. Um, if you were to ask them whether they believe in Q, it would be a lot less. But if Markan priority is correct, then the time of composing Mark or compiling Mark is closer to the time of Jesus than that of Matthew, Luke, or John. And therefore, it certainly seems that Markan passages reflect some of the earliest layers of material about Jesus that are in the New Testament Gospels. And so, if we are primarily asking historical questions about Jesus, what he actually taught and what he actually did, we might very well have a higher level of interest in Mark than in the other three Gospels if we can show that Mark earliest. And then you got a couple more. Um, um, when you read Jesus' teachings in the Gospels in the New Testament, including Mark, you are encountering them in a translated and an edited form. They've been translated from Aramaic to Greek, and the sayings and narratives have passed from one choral collection, oral and perhaps written, to another written collection, namely Mark. And then, of course, Luke 1 through 4 says that there were many narratives of what Jesus said and did. And so there is good reason to take the writer of Luke at his or her word. And so the last slide um, suggests that we would really like to know a lot more than we can really know. Um, we would like to know more than we can actually gather from the Gospels. And yet, by using historical methods and literary methods, we are actually limited by the limitations of the sources that are actually accessible to us. So there is a lot more to know about Jesus that I don't know how you'd come across it. But you're limited when you're talking about something that is as early as the Gospels. You're limited by your sources. If you're saying stuff about Jesus that's not in the earliest sources, then everyone has a right to ask, okay, why are you saying this about Jesus? What evidence do you have that what you are saying about Jesus is correct?
Well, thank you for joining me today, Frank Hughes.
Okay, well, I'm not sure that I told you that much about Ur-Markus, but that it's a pretty good theory, uh, and I think it does help to explain the minor agreements. And I think the Ur-Markus theory is good because it helps us to remember that just because you have the text of Mark, the text of Matthew, and the text of Luke in our reconstructed Gospels from our over 5,000 manuscripts, we don't know everything there is to know about Jesus from first century sources. So we have to take the sources for what they are.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.